This is the sk150. This carriage is so old that it's letters are kind of coming off, but they're still there. This one's a Singer. It would be an identical machine if it was branded Studio. I'm not positive if any of these got branded Silver Reed, but they may have. It's a very simple, sturdy workhorse of a machine and very good for beginners. The stitch dial is as it is on any other machine, how we adjust for stitch size. Some people call that tension, but I prefer to call what goes on in the mast tension and what goes on in the dial size, just so I don't get confused. This one has two settings other than O. I don't know what they really meant O to be, but I think of it as ordinary. This one's for intarsia. This one's for slip. Also, on the sides, each side has these buttons. In the back position, needles that are all the way forward, as these four are, will not knit. In the forward position, it will knit them back from hold. And I have this set to do manual tuck at the moment. I just knitted back from hold, so I need to push that back so it will continue to tuck. Now what should happen is that all the needles in ordinary working position knit, while those four that are forward are held. 1, 2, 3. And that is what's been happening. Now to get them to knit back from hold, that's all we have to do. And before we forget, that way I can reselect and do the same thing again. For this particular pattern, I'm using every third needle all the way across my work, and I'm using the same needles every time. 1, 2, 3. Set them to knit back. 4. Here's the fabric that we get from that process on the knit side. And of course you already saw the purl side. A lot of times we use the purl side of tuck because the nature of it produces a somewhat lacy look as it holds and elongates that stitch, even though there's no lace involved. Right now I'm knitting at stitch size 4, but this effect would be exaggerated if I went up a couple of stitch sizes. Another way that we can use this is to knit short rows. I've got all the needles set to knit, but I'm going to start putting needles in the hole as though knitting a sock heel or possibly the crown of some kinds of hat. So the rows get shorter and shorter. When doing this, of course, it helps to have a weight in the center because these stitches start to get looser and looser as the center piece of knitting gets longer and the edges don't. You can see why that would happen and why we need some help from more gravity than just is affecting the stitches. And now back to work. What I just did, getting shorter and shorter, is called short rowing in. And now I'm short rowing out. This is something that I do when testing a machine that's been repaired because it's a little bit more stressful for the machine than stockinette and will sometimes show up a problem that stockinette doesn't show up. However, the news is happy here. I've actually already knitted a complete hat on this machine. This is my carriage, my sinker plate, one customer's rebuilt yarn mast, and another customer's rebuilt bed. That went just super. One extremely cool thing about this particular machine is the built-in intarsia feature, which is the eye. This is how we do picture knitting, but I'm going to do the simplest possible picture. Lay the yarn manually over a few needles. Lay the next color from a separate ball over the next few needles. But did you see how I made sure these two yarns wrapped around one another? That's what prevents holes. I'm doing this one-handed, so I'm a little bit clumsy here. What I was just fixing is that a needle latch was closed. If we allow that, it'll drop a stitch. And I think I closed it myself inadvertently. Now here's the next color, and it needs to come around the blue and into the needle hooks. Intarsia always brings the needles to upper working position so that Okay, there's my little heel I made with short rowing, and here's a little section of Intarsia, and I want to show you this hole. This is where the two things began to join, and on one area where the connections began and ended over here, I've already knotted the two ends together. Here I have not, and you will need to do that to prevent this initial hole where the green and the blue stitch want to pull apart. There it is. But in the interim, where everything was wrapped every time I changed colors, there are no holes, and that's the goal. I had to go off camera to finish this because with Intarsia, where you've got needles out and yarns draped over them, you need to keep a little downward pressure, and I use my fingers to do it. You can also use a clothespin or something, but I didn't have one handy, so I went off camera and finished where I could tension the yarn a little bit. You can see how easy it would be for the yarn to just pop off of the needles, and if it does that while the carriage is passing, you have no stitches. However, this went fine, and it's a very good test. It's another one of those instances where if there's anything not quite right with either the bed or the carriage, it'll show up because Intarsia is asking more of it than regular stockinette. Okay, looking at the sk155 and the sk150, these may be badged Singer or Studio and possibly some other names. The machines are very similar, so sometimes people ask, can you use one carriage on the other bed? The answer is no. We're on the 155 bed here, and I'm going to try to twist and turn so you see that it's fitting. Here's my 150 carriage. My little tube thing that should go over the rail does not fit that far when the front of the bed is front of the carriage is in the position it would need to be. They just do not work. And it doesn't work the other way either. Also, you can see the sinker plates are very different, not interchangeable. Putting my hand down as a point of comparison, you can see that the screws would not even line up. That being said, the inner workings of the machine are not so dissimilar. This one, of course, has very few settings and no punch cards, thus it has no need of drums and a card reader, and this one does. I have enjoyed this as a good, solid, basic machine with built-in Intarsia for years, but I have never had a 155. I am testing one that Jack's fixed for a customer. Now I get why these are so much beloved by their owners. It is a solid feeling performer. I'll show you in a minute. But first, let's look at a couple of punch cards for this machine. These are 12-stitch punch cards, whereas the majority of punch card machines, except for very ancient ones, use 24-stitch cards. But these work exactly the same as all Singer Studios do. You insert the punch card in here. These little feelers read the card. They tell the drums what to do, and the drums tell the needles what to do. Just as with all machines of this style, you must run the carriage all the way past these feelers going both directions on your row. Otherwise, it won't pattern correctly. And just as with all of the studio type punch cards, there should be a part down here called a side rack. it extends this pattern. It's a little rickrack looking rubber thing. We have some on order for here. And sometimes people say, is it really that important? Hugely important, but only when knitting wide items. An adult sweater and certainly a blanket requires it, and it'll fail to pattern correctly at the edges. If I am in the middle only knitting a scarf, the machine won't know it because the carriage won't pass the unsupported area. Sometimes people wonder about the availability of 12-stitch cards, and ready-made ones aren't all that available. But there are several sites that have the patterns for you to download, and oh happy day, you can use 24-stitch blanks to do it. This is a ready-made 24-stitch card, but I can show you using it. Oops, hang on. Now you can see I've got the two cards aligned. My 12-stitch card is over a 24-stitch card. And up here you can see the row of guide holes is identical. And what you would do in order to punch a 12-stitch card on a 24-stitch card blank, and actually I have this upside down, so I'm going to flip it so you can see better. You would skip the first column of true punch card holes. Let's go up here for you. That one. And punch this one and every other one thereafter to make your 12-stitch pattern. Just ignore the in-between ones. And note that over here, the last column of true design holes is close to the feeding holes. On the left, not so close. That's the positioning arrangement. They feed in going this direction so that there is little space over here and more space over here. Just as on most punch cards, some are suitable for tuck, some for slip, some for two-color knitting, and some for all of the above. This particular one is suitable for all of the above. This top part is Fair Isle. The next part is a version of punched lace. I used sock yarn as my thread, so it's not really what you'd expect. It's a little bit more robust of a fabric, but it was doing it correctly. And down here at the bottom, I've used tuck and slip. I always start by testing a little bit of just plain old stockinette knitting, and this is doing it beautifully. I will note that I have found for this particular yarn, stitch size 3 on the dial is the best size. And I make a note of that because with this same yarn on a Brother 260, I often use stitch size 4. Of course, it varies with exactly what you're doing, but it is something to note. The different brands of machine do not necessarily have the same exact size gradation, even though they go 0 to 10. So in this case, I think this one is knitting a little bit larger of stitches at the same number size than the Brother. It's a little hard for me to be positive because I haven't knitted on a ton of 155s, but that is also my impression working on my 150, so it may be consistent. Now we're going to do some short rowing, and these buttons, or levers actually, must be set to the 1 position rather than the 2 position. See those 2 little marks? That's 1, that's 2. There is the same sort of setting on the 150, but it's on the left and right sides. They just position it differently. Does the same job. So the point of that is that when I put a needle in the hole, I want it to stay in hold, and you have to be in position 1 for that to be the case. Actually, in order to avoid holes, I normally knit across, then place the needle in hole. You can also wrap the adjacent needle, which I'm not going to do in this experiment because I am knitting one-handed and filming with the other hand. I always test short rowing because it's a little bit of a challenge, and eventually we'll need more weight in here. However, since I've already done a very lengthy piece of short rowing, we'll stop short rowing in and we'll short row out and move on to something else here. This is what you do to create a sock heel and some other shapes. Sometimes darts, although you don't normally do them on both sides of a piece, but yes, you might on some occasions, so I take that back. Now, with the card locked in place, the drums, which are under here, have already had an opportunity to memorize the pattern. So if I set the card to advance, it's on normal length. S is normal length. L would double the length of the pattern, but I just want normal. And I come over here and change this setting. We can test this card in tuck. I already know that there's a bad needle in here, and I just need to spot which one in order to change it for the customer. So if we see one error occur, no need to panic. We know why, and I'll mark that needle. Let's look a little bit closer. Here we go. Tuck. Loops are picking up but not knitting off on certain ones of the needles, and that's what makes the design. I've already done quite a good sized test of this, and it works very well. You can see the fabric developing, makes a nice pattern. So now we'll come over and we'll test slip. This does work for slip, this card. It's not an especially good looking slip card, but for a carriage test, I'm not so concerned about looks as function. That's where the slips are occurring. In this case, the selected needles, actually it's the non-selected needles, but anyway, the ones that are indicated by the card simply get strands of fabric past them. They do not knit at all, and that's what makes the design. Here I've added color 2 to feeder 2, and I will confess to you what I'm doing. I'm using the odds and ends of a sock yarn that has some weak spots in it, along with a piece of tam estilo, the end cone of that. So I'm hoping that I don't get caught in my stingy ways and this fails me, but if it does fail me, perhaps the estilo will save the day. Let's go ahead and change over here to knit in, which is the word that they used on these models to mean Fair Isle, 2-color knitting. We're just going to let the card continue to roll, and some stitches should knit pink and some should knit green, and it should gradually change which ones, and it is. And we're back to stockinette. I've actually been knitting with this carriage, well, with the whole machine, for about an hour. I like to test these really well before they come home. I want to find any issues before it leaves here. And it's passed with flying colors. I made another huge swatch and an entire hat, and this swatch, which can go home to Mama, and I think it's ready.